The letter arrived without warning, tucked neatly into the Hendersons' mailbox like any other piece of mail. At first glance, it looked official, with the HOA logo stamped across the top and the usual fine print about community standards. But when Sarah Henderson tore it open at the kitchen counter, her face went pale. The letter claimed their wooden fence, the same one that had stood around their property for decades, was non-compliant with the neighborhood guidelines. Not only did the HOA demand that it be replaced immediately, but they had also slapped the family with a fine running into the thousands. For Sarah, who had spent years budgeting carefully for her children's schooling, the news hit like a punch to the stomach. For Tom, her husband, it was infuriating. And for their kids, who played safely behind that fence every afternoon, it felt like an attack on their home. But there was one member of the family who didn't flinch, Grandpa Henderson. He read the letter, smirked, and muttered, "We'll see about that." The Hendersons weren't newcomers to Maplewood Estates. They had moved into the neighborhood a decade earlier, lured by the promise of quiet streets, neatly manicured lawns, and the idea of raising their children in a safe, friendly environment. For a while, that was exactly what they got. The kids biked along the cul-de-sacs, families waved from porches, and even the HOA seemed harmless, mostly just reminders about trimming hedges or keeping driveways clear. But everything changed the moment Margaret Fletcher was elected HOA president. Margaret was in her mid-50s, with a sharp blonde bob that framed a face perpetually locked in a disapproving scowl. She wore pearls at every meeting, carried a clipboard everywhere she went, and made it her personal mission to police every detail of the community. If a blade of grass was too tall, she noticed. If a car was parked slightly outside the lines, she took pictures. To Margaret, order and control weren't just preferences, they were obsessions. For months, the Hendersons managed to fly under her radar. They kept their yard tidy, paid their dues, and avoided unnecessary conflicts. But their fence, weathered by time and softened by the elements, drew Margaret's attention. It wasn't falling apart, but it wasn't pristine either. Some boards leaned slightly, and the paint had long since faded to a dull gray. To the Hendersons, it was nothing more than a harmless imperfection. To Margaret, it was an eyesore. She sent the first violation letter in spring, demanding the fence be replaced. When the family didn't respond, she sent another. By the third letter, she had grown impatient and aggressive, threatening escalating fines and legal action if the fence wasn't brought up to community standards. By summer, the fines had ballooned to an absurd $2,000. Around the dinner table, the Hendersons argued about what to do. Sarah worried about the financial strain. Tom considered hiring a lawyer. The kids, too young to understand the politics of an HOA, just wanted to know why that mean lady hated their fence. The tension in the room was palpable until Grandpa finally spoke. He was a retired carpenter, a man who had spent his life working with wood and tools, shaping homes and barns with steady hands. His voice was calm but firm. "Leave it to me," that was all he said, and everyone at the table knew better than to question him. Grandpa watched Margaret like a hawk over the next few weeks. She patrolled the neighborhood daily, clipboard in hand, marching up and down sidewalks with her sharp eyes trained on every property. More than once, she slowed at the Hendersons' fence, scribbling notes with that smug little smirk tugging at her lips. Grandpa didn't confront her. He didn't argue. Instead, he sat on the porch with his morning coffee, quietly sketching on scraps of graph paper. While the rest of the family worried about fines and court threats, Grandpa was planning something far bigger. The sound of construction began one Saturday morning. The steady thud of a hammer, the whir of a saw, and the smell of freshly cut wood filled the air. Neighbors peeked through blinds and craned their necks over hedges, curious to see what the Hendersons were up to. At first, they assumed it was a simple repair job. But as the old boards came down and the new structure began to rise, whispers spread across the street. This wasn't just a replacement fence. It was something extraordinary. Grandpa built with purpose. The frame grew taller by the day. 6 feet became 7, then 8, then 9. People slowed their cars to stare as the wall continued climbing. By the time it reached 12 feet, the Hendersons' backyard looked less like a suburban yard and more like a fortress. Margaret was livid. She stormed across the lawn one afternoon, waving her clipboard like a weapon. "You can't do this," she barked. "This violates everything our community stands for." Grandpa barely glanced at her, wiping sweat from his brow. "Actually," he replied, his voice even, "it doesn't. HOA Guidelines, Section 4, Paragraph 2. No maximum height restriction for privacy fences." Margaret's face tightened as she flipped through her binder of bylaws. He was right, and she knew it. Every nail, every beam, every coat of paint was done by the book. The Hendersons hadn't just fixed their fence. They had built a 12-foot monument to legality, and yet the most ingenious part hadn't been revealed. By late August, the fence was complete. From a distance, it looked exactly like what the HOA wanted. Solid wood, painted in the community's approved shade of beige, standing tall and sturdy. To Margaret's eye, however, something seemed off. It was too quiet, too perfect. She marched up to the Hendersons' property one final time, ready to find a flaw. But as she stood before the wall, her breath caught in her throat. The fence wasn't just beige, it was mirrored. Polished panels reflected her image back at her with startling clarity. Her sharp glare, her pinched expression, the clipboard clutched so tightly her knuckles whitened. She was staring at herself, and the fence gave her nowhere to look but inward. Neighbors gathered on sidewalks, stifling laughter as they pulled out phones to record the scene. One teenager whispered, "She looks like she's arguing with herself." Margaret snapped. She jabbed her pen at the mirrored wall, shouting about mockery and community spirit. Grandpa leaned casually against the fence, arms crossed, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "It's compliant," he said simply. "Beige paint, proper height, structurally sound, nothing in the rules against mirrors." Margaret's face flushed red, but she had no comeback. The fence was legal in every way, and she knew it. Her only opponent was her own reflection, which stared back at her with unrelenting precision. The video of Margaret's meltdown hit social media that night. Within days, it spread across town. Clips of her shouting at her own reflection circulated with captions like "HOA versus HOA" and "Mirror, mirror on the fence." The once feared president of Maplewood Estates was reduced to a punchline. Her power was gone, shattered not by violence or rebellion, but by the cleverness of one determined grandfather who refused to be bullied. For the Hendersons, life settled into peace. The fines vanished, the threats stopped. Their children played in the yard once more, protected by the shadow of Grandpa's fortress. The neighbors, once too afraid to speak up, now greeted Grandpa with respect, some even joking about hiring him to build mirrored fences of their own. As for Margaret, she could no longer bear to walk near the Hendersons' property. When she had to pass by, she quickened her pace, eyes fixed on the ground. Because if she dared to look up, she knew what she would see, her own furious face glaring back. In the end, the battle over the fence wasn't just about wood and paint. It was about standing up to bullies. It was about knowing the rules so well that you could turn them into armor. Most of all, it was about protecting family and home, no matter the cost. Grandpa hadn't just rebuilt a fence, he had built a symbol. A reminder that power can be challenged and that sometimes the best revenge isn't to break the rules, but to master them. Margaret Fletcher learned that lesson the hard way, and for the rest of her tenure as HOA president, she never so much as glanced in the Hendersons' direction. Because in the end, the only thing she would ever see was herself.